This morning on KUNM, we were talking about the media and what is wrong with the media. And I can't remember if I gave the analogy there. There's a new story we just put up on our website about the New York Times coverage of Mitt Romney. Just went up. Anybody see that yet? You saw that. Okay. I was struck by this flurry. Any of you read the New York Times on a regular basis? Okay, about a third of you. There have suddenly been this burst of coverage of Mitt Romney, and maybe really of all the candidates. And my first thought was, gee, I sure wish the New York Times did that kind of a scramble on, why we were in Iraq. A little more reporting on the story behind September 11. You name it. I would love to see a little more reporting on most of those stories. They don't even have a single person on full time. They have no investigative thing. But when it comes to Mitt Romney, here's what we got. We learned in the last week about his relationship with his barber, that he does not color his hair, supposedly, like Ronald Reagan. We learned about his relationship with his wife. We learned that he makes a huge amount of money but doesn't spend any of it and is extremely cheap. We learned that though his company seems to me to have been involved in some things worth investigating, the conclusion that I got from that article was, not really too bad. Nothing to see here. Let's move on. And what I took away from this collection of articles, and which resulted in the new piece up on WhoWhatWhy.com, is that the New York Times kind of has decided he's not a bad guy. And they would be okay with him as the Republican nominee, much preferred over Newt Romney. And you might say, well, a Newt Gingrich. Was that Freudian or what? Newt Romney, I like the sound of that. And so they much prefer him, and I suppose many people might. But what's interesting to me is that if you actually study the New York Times over the years, they've always sort of supported a narrowing of the field until both candidates, both nominees of both parties, are virtually indistinguishable from each other. They're more similar than they are different. Now, there are big differences typically between a Democratic and a Republican nominee. To some extent, and anybody here from labor can probably correct me on this, but there are some differences on issues relating to workers. There are certainly some differences on environmental issues. Some, mind you, not on the pipeline, not on the controversial pipeline right now. Not on substantively on climate change, not on, well, see, when we start listing things and then we say, well, not on war, not on Wall Street, not on fundamental inequities in society. There are some differences, but the reality is on the key issues that the most powerful people in the world care about, there are very, very few substantive differences. And so I would say that when people, you always hear them talk about the liberal media, and I find a lot of those phrases to be disinformation from the get-go, because it's like calling Obama a socialist. The people who call him a socialist don't believe it for a second, but they figure if they put him on the defensive, he's going to be pushing even further to the right. It's the same thing with the media. If they call us the liberal media, we hurry to prove that we're not. And yet, the media itself doesn't bother to say, wait a minute, here's what's going on here. This is disinformation in itself. And I think that if you talk to most reporters, they're hardly wild-eyed radicals at all. They're very much creatures of the establishment. These days, most of them earn a pretty good salary if they have a job, at least with the larger news organizations, and they're very much middle class. The rest can't get any work at all, but I mean those who work at the New York Times and NPR and all of these big places really do pretty well for themselves. And I know that a lot of them have children in expensive private schools and so forth. So the idea that they're very much wild-eyed is disproved. It's also disproved by a recent piece in the New York Times by their public editor where he was the public editor's job is to try to figure out to sort of represent the public and figure out what could the paper be doing better. So his quandary was how to cover Occupy. How do you cover the Occupy movement? And we did an article on the site there. I quoted from him, and then he reached out to a few sort of senior people who had been at other news organizations. He said, what do you think? How do you cover this thing? And they all were perplexed. They really couldn't figure out what this was about. What do these people want? One of them said, why are they doing this now? The recession has been going on for a few years. To which I replied, well, they're not really protesting the recession. Somebody else said, I don't even know who they are. What is a typical protester? Is it an ex-Lehman executive who fell in hard times? I mean, maybe that was a joke, but it didn't seem to be, and that really scared me. Anyway, I have spent about a quarter century now in journalism. I've worked for a lot of the marquee brands, everything from the corporate-owned larger organizations, newspapers, magazines, TV, radio, to the so-called alternative press. And I increasingly came to the conclusion that I wasn't happy with either, if you can consider them to be discrete things. And the reason is this. When I work for the so-called mainstream media, I'm supposed to be objective, and what that really means is that you are supposed to treat everybody the same. So when you interview an executive of a company where you actually know that he's lying through his teeth, you still say, Mr. So-and-so says. You don't say, Mr. So-and-so is lying. You say that privately over drinks to your friends. And I would love to have a radio station where it was all audio of journalists having drinks. What do you think of that? Having drinks news. Because it would be shocking to you. Because what they say is completely different than what's in their reports. I mean, completely. And so this frustrated me because when we're in the mainstream media, our job is to not take sides and yet try to tell people something. Well, the end result is when we're doing that, we don't tell people anything. You come away from it not really being sure what it is that the reporter wanted to convey to you. And it seemed to me that reporters are our representatives, that we need to trust them to go out, find out what's going on, and then just tell us. Now, my beef with the alternative media, whether it's the liberal left magazines or, of course, Fox News on the right, is that they all have agendas. And I can tell you that if you go in and you do a story, and I don't care whether it's them or it's your favorite cable news thing that's sort of liberal-ish, or it's a weekly magazine of opinion on the left, you can choose whichever one you want. If you come in with a story that is not going to get their readers nodding, yes, this is exactly what I think, they're just not going to publish it. And so it took me years and years and years to try to figure out why it was that I was always having problems with whatever place I was working for, that they always had a preconceived notion of what they wanted me to bring in. And so I finally decided, forget it, I'm just going to do my own thing. And I started from scratch a nonprofit organization and a website called WhoWhatWhy.com. And the reason that I am traveling around the country and the reason I'm here tonight in Albuquerque is because we need your help. Unlike Mitt Romney, I am neither frugal nor wealthy. I can't do this kind of work. I can't hire up a team of really terrific reporters to do this. We can't get the word out to people without a lot of help. We need help on all different levels, and I'll circle back to that at the end of this conversation. Or decide to do this. In 2004, I began doing something else. At the same time I began thinking about an organization like this, I began working on what turned into my first book, Family of Secrets. I was actually living abroad in 2002, 2003, and Serbia, the former Yugoslavia, training journalists over there in how to do investigative reporting, actually funded by the State Department, which thought that it would be great if we could teach these people how to keep their government honest and get to the bottom of things. And I thought, well, why did the State Department fund that in the U.S.? So, but they don't do that. It's kind of like a lot of these news organizations that you see. Then all the journalism awards for people who write about the plight of gold miners in Paraguay or something. But there's very little about the problems of workers in the United States. Anyway, I was training these journalists, and it began the run up to the war in Iraq, and I was so amazed by this. I mean, it seemed clear to me that this whole thing was trumped up. And I wrote articles at the time before the invasion began. I said, hey, wait a minute, this is crazy. How can they be rushing to do this thing? It's so obviously something they want to do more than something that they need to do. And as I traveled around Europe, the other thing that struck me was the growing animosity aimed at me as a representative of the evil Satan, the United States, which previously had been seen by perhaps not the Serbs, but people in many European countries as they had an overly rosy analysis or estimate of the United States, and now it had shifted to where none of us could do right. I literally had people wanting to spit in my face, and I thought, George W. Bush has really changed everything, and he's changed the relationship of Americans with each other. Think about our body scans and frisking and our terror to speak openly about things. But he's also changed our relationship with the rest of the world. And it struck me that this was really a very radical development in the history of the United States. And I finally, in 2004, and I could have stayed on longer there. It was very cheap to live there and kind of an interesting experience, but I decided to head back. And I thought, I better get involved here, because it seems to me that nobody's digging into what is really going on in America. I don't want to say nobody is doing this, that would be untrue, but there was not a dominant movement within journalism to do that. So I returned home and I began working on a number of stories for magazines. And I remember as I was digging into Bush, I started finding some things out, and the magazine said to me, you know what, unless you can catch him having personally murdered somebody, I don't think anything's going to make any difference. Doesn't matter what it is. And I said, well, this National Guard thing is pretty interesting. I mean, here he is. He started a war, and thousands of Americans and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis are dying. It's kind of interesting that there's some controversy as to whether he disappeared from the U.S. military during the Vietnam War. I mean, wouldn't that seem to be a legitimate journalistic inquiry? So I did dig into that, and what I found was very interesting to me, and I published it in a number of places, particularly The Nation online. And it became very clear to me that he literally had skipped out, that he had just disappeared for 2 years, and I began to see the fingerprints of his father. And I began to see that his father, who was powerful at the time, had to have known and wanted this not to be a stain upon the family. And that was very interesting to me. And so after the election, I turned to working on this book, and I had no idea what I would find. And again, I think that is one of the basic rules of good journalism, is you have to go in, you can have a hunch or an instinct, but you have to be open to the idea that you're going to be wrong. That the person you thought was a villain will turn out to be much more nuanced, that the person you thought was very nuanced will turn out to be really quite a villain. Whatever it is, you have to be open. I was open to the idea that maybe George W. Bush actually had served, and he just was having trouble proving it. I did not find that. You will be shocked to hear. But I became very interested in their family, and so as I began working on this book, I thought, I just want to see if there's a deeper narrative to explain the trauma that this country was going through and the radical changes. And I spent about 5 years researching Family of Secrets. And the first year or two, I found little hints of things, but not really very much. And then I started pushing on a few doors, and suddenly one thing after another, and it became quicker and quicker and quicker. And pretty quickly, not quickly, but after 2 years, I was into kind of like a girl with dragon tattoo land. And I have to tell you, the truth really is stranger than fiction. And what is really going on in this country and in the world is so bleeping scary. You have no idea. Now, if you want to leave right now, go ahead, because you're probably not going to sleep well tonight. It's terrifying. It is terrifying. And it's interesting to me because as I discuss these kinds of issues, I encounter a certain amount of resistance from some people. I see their bodies tense up. They become very, very unhappy with this. Some people leave. And then other people start using terms. They throw around terms like, well, are you a conspiracy theorist?